The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table as 12-year-old Princess Isabella sat rigidly in her chair, her small hands trembling as she reached for the wrong fork. The sharp intake of breath from her governess, Lady Margaret, echoed through the grand dining hall like a gunshot in the silence. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but she dared not let them fall. In the world of royalty, even a child's emotions had to follow protocol. This was not just dinner. This was education in the ancient language of power, respect, and tradition that had governed royal households for centuries. Every gesture, every glance, every pause between bites carried weight that could shift political alliances, seal diplomatic agreements, or signal approval or disapproval that could change the course of nations. Lady Margaret had served the royal family for 37 years, having started as a young woman barely out of finishing school herself. She understood better than anyone that these seemingly rigid rules were not mere formality. They were the invisible threads that held together a monarchy that had survived wars, revolutions, and the relentless march of time. Each protocol had been written in the blood of history, born from mistakes that had cost kingdoms and shaped by triumphs that had elevated nations. "Your Highness," Lady Margaret whispered, her voice gentle but firm, "remember that the salad fork is always on the outside." Isabella nodded, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She had studied these rules for months, practiced them until her fingers cramped, yet under the watchful eyes of visiting dignitaries from 3 different nations, her mind had gone blank. The visiting ambassador from Baldoria, a stern man with steel-gray hair named Lord Hendrik, watched the exchange with calculating eyes. He had been testing the young princess all evening, noting how she handled pressure, observing whether the royal family was truly prepared to honor the ancient treaty that their grandfathers had signed in blood 50 years ago. Every mistake Isabella made was being catalogued, every success noted. This was diplomacy at its most subtle and most crucial. Isabella's mother, Queen Sophia, sat at the head of the table with the composure of marble statue, but her heart ached for her daughter. She remembered her own childhood dinners, the suffocating weight of expectation, the knowledge that every meal was a performance where failure could have consequences that reached far beyond the dining room. She had learned these lessons through tears and sleepless nights, through the patient but relentless instruction of her own governess, and through the gradual understanding that she was not just a child learning table manners, but a future queen learning to communicate in a language that predated words themselves. The queen's own journey with royal dining protocols had begun when she was even younger than Isabella. Born into minor nobility in the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, she had been thrust into this world when she married Isabella's father, King Alexander. The first royal dinner she attended as crown princess had been a disaster that still made her stomach clench with remembered humiliation. She had reached across the table instead of asking for something to be passed, had spoken before being addressed, and had committed the cardinal sin of beginning to eat before the king had taken his first bite. The newspapers had been merciless the next day. "New princess needs lessons in basic courtesy," one headline had screamed. "Is our future queen fit for the crown?" another had questioned. But what hurt most was not the public embarrassment, but the look of disappointment in her new father-in-law's eyes, the way the courtiers whispered behind their hands, and the growing realization that every aspect of her life would now be scrutinized and judged. That humiliation had driven her to master these protocols with an intensity that surprised even her harshest critics. She studied historical records of royal dinners, learned the reasoning behind each rule, and gradually came to understand that these were not arbitrary restrictions but a complex communication system that had evolved over centuries. When a royal picked up their napkin, it signaled to everyone else that the meal could begin. When they placed their knife and fork parallel on their plate, it indicated they were finished. When they turned slightly toward their dinner companion, it showed who had their attention and favor. These signals could make or break careers, could indicate which policies had royal support, could even hint at potential marriages or alliances. Foreign diplomats spent years learning to read these subtle cues, because a misinterpreted gesture could derail negotiations that had taken months to arrange. King Alexander himself had grown up understanding this language instinctively, born into it as he was, but he had learned its deeper importance during the most challenging period of his reign. 7 years ago, when the kingdom faced its worst economic crisis in decades, it was a series of carefully orchestrated royal dinners that had saved the nation from collapse. The financial markets were in freefall, unemployment was rising, and neighboring countries were beginning to question the stability of the kingdom. Traditional diplomatic channels were moving too slowly, and public speeches were being dismissed as empty political rhetoric. But, when King Alexander invited the leaders of 5 major international corporations to what appeared to be a simple social dinner, the subtle messages he conveyed through the seating arrangements, the courses served, and his own behavior at the table spoke louder than any formal negotiation could have. By serving traditional dishes from each guest's homeland, he showed respect for their heritage. By personally ensuring that each guest's dietary restrictions were accommodated, he demonstrated attention to detail and genuine care. By the way he listened, responded, and gestured throughout the evening, he communicated confidence, stability, and worthiness of investment. Within a week of that dinner, those corporations had committed to major projects in the kingdom, providing the economic boost needed to weather the crisis. Isabella, of course, knew none of these adult complexities as she sat struggling with her fork. To her, these were simply rules that seemed designed to make eating as difficult as possible. She couldn't understand why she couldn't just enjoy her food, why every bite had to be calculated, why she couldn't laugh freely at her younger brother's jokes the way she did in the privacy of their playroom. Prince Marcus, only 8 years old, sat beside her with the natural ease that came from not yet being old enough to bear the full weight of royal expectations. He could still make small mistakes that were dismissed as childish charm, could still eat with the enthusiasm of a normal child. But Isabella, as the heir to the throne, was held to different standards. Every year brought new responsibilities, new protocols to master, new ways that her natural impulses had to be suppressed in service of the crown. The irony was not lost on Queen Sophia that these elaborate protocols, designed to demonstrate refinement and civilization, often felt deeply uncivilized in their demands on a child's natural spirit. Yet she also knew that Isabella would one day be grateful for this training, just as she had eventually become grateful for her own painful education in royal deportment. The dinner continued with the mechanical precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. Courses appeared and disappeared with perfect timing, conversations flowed according to established patterns, and every participant played their role in the ancient drama of royal hospitality. But, beneath the surface, real human emotions churned like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Lord Hendrik was growing increasingly impressed with the family's discipline and attention to tradition. His own nation placed enormous value on protocol and proper behavior, and he was seeing evidence that this kingdom still understood the importance of these things in an age when many royal families had abandoned such formalities. His report to his king would be favorable, which meant the trade agreements they were negotiating would likely proceed smoothly. Lady Margaret watched Isabella struggle and remembered her own granddaughter, who lived a normal life, who could eat dinner while watching television, who could interrupt her parents without causing an international incident. Sometimes she wondered if they were asking too much of these children, whether the weight of tradition was worth the sacrifice of simple childhood joy. But, then, she would remember the alternative. She had lived through the reign of a king who had rejected protocol, who had tried to modernize everything, including royal dining customs. The result had been chaos. Foreign dignitaries felt disrespected, traditional allies questioned the kingdom's commitment to established relationships, and what had been intended as refreshing informality had been interpreted as dangerous instability. The meal progressed through its 7 courses, each one presenting new challenges and opportunities for Isabella to demonstrate her growing mastery of royal protocol. She managed the soup course without incident, properly breaking her bread rolls into small pieces before buttering them, and successfully navigated the complex wine service even though she was only allowed to have sparkling grape juice in her crystal goblet. As the evening wore on, something began to shift in Isabella's understanding. She started to notice how her mother's subtle gestures were being read and responded to by their guests. She saw how a slight nod from her father could change the entire direction of a conversation, how the queen's choice of which guest to address first after each course was being carefully noted and interpreted. Slowly, Isabella began to realize that this was not just about eating properly. This was about communication, leadership, and the delicate art of managing relationships between powerful people. She was not just learning to use the right fork, she was learning to speak a language that could prevent wars, build alliances, and guide her future kingdom toward prosperity. The revelation came as the final course was being served. Isabella noticed that Lord Hendrik had been watching her throughout the meal, and she suddenly understood that her performance was not just about avoiding embarrassment. It was about proving that she was worthy of the respect of other nations, that she could be trusted to honor agreements and maintain the dignity of her position. With this new understanding, Isabella straightened her shoulders and completed the meal with renewed focus and purpose. She was no longer a child struggling with arbitrary rules, but a future queen learning the tools she would need to protect and serve her people. When the meal finally concluded and the guests departed, Isabella expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt something she hadn't anticipated: pride. She had successfully completed one of the most challenging tests of her young life, and, in doing so, had taken another step toward the crown that would one day be hers. That night, as Lady Margaret helped her prepare for bed, Isabella asked a question that showed how much she had grown during that single evening. "Lady Margaret, when I am queen, will people judge my kingdom based on how I behave at dinner?" Lady Margaret smiled, seeing in the young princess's eyes the dawning wisdom that would one day make her a great ruler. "Yes, Your Highness. But now you understand why that matters, and that understanding will make you stronger than any protocol ever could." As Isabella drifted off to sleep, she dreamed not of the suffocating rules she had learned, but of the power she was beginning to understand she possessed. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, and new opportunities to master the silent language that would help her guide her kingdom toward a bright future. 5 years had passed since that transformative dinner, and Princess Isabella, now 17, moved through the elaborate dining rituals with the grace of someone born to the role. But tonight was different. Tonight, she faced her greatest test yet, hosting her first solo diplomatic dinner as crown princess, with the weight of a potential war hanging in the balance. The crisis had erupted 3 months earlier when their neighboring kingdom of Nordheim had accused Isabella's kingdom of violating a centuries-old water rights treaty. What had started as a dispute over river access had escalated into military posturing, with both sides moving troops to their shared border. Traditional diplomacy had failed, and now the young crown prince of Nordheim, Eric, had agreed to one final attempt at peaceful resolution through the ancient ritual of a royal dinner. Isabella stood in her private chambers, her hands surprisingly steady as her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, helped her into the deep blue silk gown that had been chosen for its diplomatic significance. Blue was Nordheim's royal color, a subtle signal of respect and willingness to find common ground. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated with the same precision used to plan military campaigns. Sarah had been with Isabella for 2 years, replacing the elderly Lady Margaret who had finally retired to a peaceful cottage in the countryside. Sarah was closer to Isabella's age, which made their relationship less formal but no less important. She had become not just an attendant but a confidant, someone who understood the immense pressure that came with being groomed for a throne. "Your Highness," Sarah whispered as she fastened the sapphire necklace that had belonged to Isabella's great-grandmother, "you've prepared for this moment your entire life. Trust in that training." Isabella nodded, but inside she was battling waves of doubt. Crown Prince Eric was known for his sharp intellect and his grandfather's stubborn pride. He was also devastatingly handsome, which added an unexpected complication to an already complex situation. Isabella had met him once before, at a neutral diplomatic gathering 2 years earlier, and had been surprised by both his wit and his seemingly genuine desire for peace. The timing of this dinner could not have been more critical. Intelligence reports suggested that hardline advisors in both kingdoms were pushing for military action. Eric's father, King Magnus, was reportedly growing impatient with diplomatic solutions, and Isabella's own father was facing pressure from Parliament to take a stronger stance. This dinner might be the last chance to prevent a conflict that could devastate both nations. As Isabella made her way to the state dining room, she thought about the weeks of preparation that had led to this moment. Every aspect of the evening had been planned with meticulous attention to historical precedent and symbolic meaning. The menu included dishes from both kingdoms' culinary traditions, prepared by chefs who had spent months perfecting recipes that would honor both heritages without favoring either. The seating arrangement alone had taken 3 days to finalize. Isabella would sit at the head of the table, with Eric to her right in the position of honor traditionally reserved for the most important guest. Her parents would be present but seated further down the table, a deliberate choice to emphasize that this was Isabella's negotiation, her opportunity to prove herself ready for future leadership. The dining room itself had been transformed into a neutral space that avoided any obvious display of either kingdom's superiority. Flowers from both nations adorned the table, and the china pattern chosen was a rare set that had been created to commemorate the original peace treaty signed between their great-grandfathers. Every fork, every crystal goblet, every candle had been placed with the understanding that their arrangement would be scrutinized and interpreted by experts in royal protocol. Isabella entered the dining room 30 minutes before Eric's arrival, using the time to review once more the carefully rehearsed conversation topics that had been prepared by the kingdom's most skilled diplomats. She needed to appear informed but not aggressive, interested in peace but not desperate, confident in her position but open to compromise. It was a delicate balance that would require all the skills she had spent years developing. The doors opened precisely at 8 o'clock, and Crown Prince Eric entered with his small delegation. Isabella rose to greet him, extending her hand in the formal gesture that would set the tone for everything that followed. Their eyes met as he bowed slightly and kissed her gloved hand, and she saw in his expression the same mixture of hope and apprehension that she felt herself. Eric was taller than she remembered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in formal settings. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his military dress uniform immaculate, but it was his eyes that captured her attention. They held intelligence and wariness, but also something that looked like genuine respect for the magnitude of what they were attempting to accomplish. "Your Royal Highness," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that she found unexpectedly appealing. "Thank you for hosting this evening. I hope we can find the wisdom that our predecessors showed when they first established peace between our kingdoms." Isabella inclined her head gracefully, her response carefully crafted to acknowledge his words while asserting her own position. "Prince Eric, welcome to our home. Our kingdoms have shared both conflict and prosperity throughout history. Tonight, we have the opportunity to choose which legacy we will leave for our children." As they moved to their seats, Isabella was acutely aware that every word, every gesture was being observed and analyzed. The small delegation from Nordheim included Eric's senior advisor, General Carlson, a man whose stern expression suggested he viewed this diplomatic dinner as a waste of time. Isabella's own advisors included Foreign Minister Harrison, whose decades of experience in international relations had made him invaluable during the crisis, and her mentor in royal protocol, Ambassador Stevens, who would watch for any subtle signals that might indicate how the evening was progressing. The first course arrived with the precision of clockwork, a delicate soup that represented a fusion of both kingdoms' culinary traditions. As Isabella lifted her spoon, she was transported back to those early lessons with Lady Margaret, remembering how each movement at a royal table carried meaning beyond the simple act of eating. Eric proved to be an accomplished dinner companion, engaging in the kind of sophisticated small talk that allowed both of them to demonstrate their education and cultural awareness without immediately diving into the contentious issues that had brought them together. They discussed art, literature, and music, finding surprising common ground in their shared appreciation for classical composers and their mutual love of equestrian sports. As the conversation flowed, Isabella began to see beneath the formal exterior to the man Eric really was. She noticed how he listened carefully to every response, how he asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and how he managed to be both charming and respectful without crossing into familiarity. She also noticed that he was as carefully controlled as she was, every word chosen with diplomatic precision. The second course brought more substantial conversation as they moved into topics that touched more closely on the issues dividing their kingdoms. Eric spoke eloquently about Nordheim's perspective on the water rights dispute, presenting his kingdom's position with clarity and conviction while avoiding any language that could be construed as threatening or dismissive. Isabella found herself genuinely impressed by his approach. He acknowledged her kingdom's concerns while maintaining his own position, and he demonstrated a thorough understanding of the historical complexities that had led to the current crisis. More importantly, he seemed genuinely committed to finding a solution that both kingdoms could accept. As the meal progressed through its carefully orchestrated courses, the conversation gradually deepened. They discussed the economic implications of the dispute, the environmental considerations that both kingdoms needed to address, and the political pressures that both were facing from their own populations. Isabella was surprised to discover that Eric was dealing with many of the same challenges she faced: advisors who favored military action, public opinion that demanded strong leadership, and the constant pressure to prove himself worthy of future kingship. By the time the fourth course arrived, something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The initial formality had given way to what felt like genuine dialogue between two young leaders who recognized that they had more in common than either had expected. Isabella found herself speaking more freely, sharing insights that went beyond the prepared talking points her advisors had crafted. "The burden of these crowns we will inherit," Eric said during a pause in the conversation, his voice carrying a note of weariness that Isabella recognized all too well. "Sometimes I wonder if our ancestors understood what they were asking of us when they built these kingdoms on centuries of tradition and expectation." Isabella looked at him with new understanding. "They understood," she replied softly. "They knew that leadership requires sacrifice. But I think they also believed that those sacrifices could create something better for the people we serve. The question is whether we have the wisdom to honor their intentions while adapting to our own time." The exchange marked a turning point in their conversation. Both seemed to recognize that they were no longer speaking simply as representatives of their kingdoms, but as young people grappling with enormous responsibility and trying to find a path forward that honored both their duties and their consciences. General Carlson, Eric's advisor, had been growing increasingly restless throughout the meal. He clearly believed that military action was the only way to resolve the dispute, and he viewed this diplomatic dinner as a delay tactic that weakened Nordheim's position. Isabella noticed how he tensed whenever Eric seemed to move toward compromise, and she realized that Eric was facing pressure from his own advisors that mirrored what she experienced. As they moved into the later courses of the meal, Isabella made a decision that went against her advisor's recommendations but felt right in the moment. She began to share more specific ideas for resolving the water rights dispute, proposals that her own diplomatic team had developed but had been reluctant to reveal too early in the negotiations. Eric responded with his own concrete suggestions, and together they began to sketch out the framework for an agreement that neither of their kingdoms had previously considered. It involved a complex sharing arrangement for the disputed water resources, combined with a joint environmental protection program that would benefit both nations while providing face-saving measures that would allow both sides to claim victory. Foreign Minister Harrison watched this development with a mixture of admiration and concern. He was impressed by Isabella's diplomatic instincts and her ability to think creatively under pressure, but he worried that she was moving too quickly, offering too much without securing sufficient concessions in return. But Isabella had recognized something that her more experienced advisors had missed. Eric was genuinely interested in peace, and he was willing to take political risks to achieve it. By offering concrete proposals and demonstrating good faith, she was creating an opportunity for him to reciprocate without losing face before his own delegation. The strategy worked. By the time dessert arrived, they had outlined the basic structure of an agreement that could prevent war while addressing the core concerns of both kingdoms. More importantly, they had established a personal connection that would make future negotiations more productive. As the formal dinner concluded and they moved to the adjoining reception room for coffee and brandy, Isabella felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the specific diplomatic progress they had made. She had proven to herself that all those years of training in royal protocol and diplomatic etiquette had prepared her for exactly this kind of moment. The evening ended with a private conversation between Isabella and Eric, away from their advisors and the formal constraints of the diplomatic setting. In those few minutes, they spoke not as crown princess and crown prince, but as two young people who had discovered they shared similar hopes for their kingdoms and their own futures. "I hope this is only the beginning," Eric said as he prepared to depart. "Our kingdoms have much to gain from closer cooperation, and I believe we have shown tonight that our generation may be better equipped to achieve that than our predecessors were." Isabella agreed, and, as she watched his carriage disappear into the night, she felt confident that they had accomplished something significant. The specific details of their agreement would need to be refined by their diplomatic teams, but the foundation for peace had been laid through the ancient ritual of royal hospitality and the timeless power of human connection. The news reached Queen Isabella, now 25 and having ruled for 3 years since her father's passing, on a cold February morning that would forever change her understanding of how deeply personal and political intersect at the royal dinner table. Prince Eric, now King Eric of Nordheim and her closest ally among neighboring monarchs, had been seriously injured in a riding accident. The message, delivered by a breathless courier, was brief but devastating. Eric was fighting for his life, and his kingdom was in chaos. Isabella stood at the window of her private study, still wearing the simple black dress she had chosen for what was supposed to be a quiet day of reviewing domestic policy proposals. The irony was not lost on her that she had spent the morning reading reports about agricultural reforms while the man who had become both her strongest diplomatic partner and, if she was honest with herself, something much more personal, lay unconscious in a palace 300 miles away. The relationship between their kingdoms had flourished in the years following that first diplomatic dinner. The water rights agreement they had sketched out during their carefully orchestrated meal had evolved into a comprehensive treaty that had brought unprecedented prosperity to both nations. More significantly, Isabella and Eric had developed a personal friendship that had deepened through a series of state visits, diplomatic conferences, and private correspondence that had gradually moved beyond purely professional matters. Sarah, now her chief lady-in-waiting and trusted confidant, entered the study with the morning's diplomatic correspondence. One look at Isabella's face told her that something was terribly wrong. "Your Majesty?" Sarah asked, using the formal address that Isabella still sometimes found strange, even after 3 years on the throne. "King Eric has been injured," Isabella said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Badly injured. I need to go to Nordheim immediately." Sarah's expression shifted from concern to worry. She understood better than most what Eric's friendship meant to Isabella, and she also understood the political implications of the Queen traveling to Nordheim during a crisis. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should consult with the foreign minister first. There are protocols to consider, and questions of how such a visit might be interpreted." But Isabella had already made her decision, driven by an urgency that transcended diplomatic considerations. Arrange for a small delegation. We leave this afternoon. And, Sarah, send word ahead that I wish to host a dinner for the Nordheim royal family and senior advisors tomorrow evening. It will give me an opportunity to assess the situation and demonstrate our kingdom's continued support during this crisis. The journey to Nordheim took 6 hours by royal carriage, time that Isabella used to think about the complex web of relationships and obligations that had led to this moment. Eric had become more than an ally, he had become a true friend, and, though neither had ever spoken the words aloud, something approaching love had grown between them during their diplomatic correspondence and state visits. Their relationship existed in the strange twilight zone that governed royal friendships, where personal feelings were always secondary to political considerations, yet where personal connections could be the foundation of international stability. Isabella had received several marriage proposals from princes and nobles across Europe, but none had interested her the way Eric did. He understood the burdens of leadership because he carried them himself, and he treated her as an equal rather than a potential acquisition. The irony was that their growing closeness had actually made marriage between them more difficult rather than easier. A political marriage between strangers could be arranged based purely on diplomatic advantages, but a marriage between two monarchs who genuinely cared for each other carried emotional risks that their advisors found deeply troubling. Love could cloud judgment, could lead to favoritism in trade negotiations, could create conflicts between personal desires and national interests. Isabella arrived at the Nordheim Palace as evening shadows were falling across the ancient stone walls. The normally bustling courtyard was subdued, with servants moving quietly about their duties and guards standing at extra attention. The atmosphere was heavy with the kind of uncertainty that comes when a kingdom's future suddenly becomes unclear. Eric's younger sister, Princess Astrid, met Isabella at the palace entrance. Astrid had always been more outgoing than her serious older brother, but tonight her usual vivacity was replaced by worry and exhaustion. "Isabella," Astrid said, abandoning royal protocol in her relief at seeing a friendly face. "Thank you for coming. The doctors say he's stable, but he hasn't regained consciousness since the accident. There are already whispers about succession, about what happens if." Isabella took Astrid's hands in hers, offering the comfort that protocol usually prevented between royals. "He's strong, and he has too much left to accomplish to give up now. But, whatever happens, Nordheim will not face this crisis alone. That's why I've arranged dinner for tomorrow evening. We need to ensure that your kingdom's stability is maintained, regardless of what the next few days bring." The dinner Isabella had planned was unlike any royal meal she had ever organized. Rather than a celebration or a negotiation, this would be a gathering designed to project strength and continuity during a crisis. Every detail would need to signal that Nordheim's relationships with neighboring kingdoms remained secure, that the government continued to function effectively, and that the royal family was united and capable of leadership. Isabella spent the morning of the dinner working with Astrid and the Nordheim protocol staff to plan an event that would serve multiple purposes. The guest list included senior ministers, military leaders, and foreign ambassadors, all of whom needed reassurance about the kingdom's stability. The seating arrangement placed Astrid in Eric's traditional seat, symbolically demonstrating that leadership continued even in his absence. The menu was chosen to reflect Nordheim's strength and prosperity, featuring traditional dishes that connected the current crisis to the kingdom's long history of overcoming challenges. Each course would tell a story of resilience, reminding everyone present that this kingdom had survived wars, famines, and political upheavals that were far worse than a riding accident, however serious. Isabella herself would sit to Astrid's right in the position traditionally reserved for the most honored guest, a placement that would signal her kingdom's continued support while allowing Astrid to demonstrate her own capability as a potential leader. As the afternoon progressed, Isabella received regular updates on Eric's condition. He remained unconscious but stable, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about his chances for recovery. However, they warned that even if he survived, he might face months of rehabilitation, creating a leadership vacuum at a time when Nordheim faced several pressing challenges. The dinner began promptly at 7 o'clock, with Isabella and Astrid receiving guests in the formal reception room before moving to the state dining room. Isabella watched Astrid carefully during these initial moments, noticing how the younger princess drew strength from the familiar rituals of royal hospitality. The protocols that could feel suffocating during normal times now provided structure and comfort during crisis. General Carlson, Eric's former advisor who had been skeptical of diplomatic solutions, was among the guests. His presence was particularly important because his support for Astrid's temporary leadership could help prevent any military challenges to civilian authority.
Isabella made a point of engaging him in conversation, demonstrating that she viewed him as a valuable ally rather than an opponent.
General, Isabella said as they moved to their seats, King Eric has spoken often of your dedication to Nordheim's security.
During this challenging time, that dedication is more valuable than ever.
Carlson, who had initially been suspicious of Isabella's influence over Eric, had gradually come to respect her judgment and her commitment to regional stability. Your Majesty, your presence here tonight sends a powerful message about the strength of our alliance. Whatever challenges we face, we do not face them alone. As the meal progressed, Isabella carefully orchestrated conversations that reinforced themes of stability, continuity, and international support. She spoke knowledgeably about Nordheim's domestic policies, demonstrating that she understood and supported Eric's governance approach. She asked thoughtful questions about current challenges, showing that she viewed Nordheim as a true partner rather than a subordinate ally. Most importantly, she consistently referred to Eric's eventual recovery and return to leadership, projecting confidence in his survival while subtly preparing everyone for the possibility that recovery might take longer than hoped. This delicate balance required all the diplomatic skills she had developed over years of royal dinners. Astrid proved to be a natural at this kind of diplomatic communication. She spoke with authority about government policies, fielded questions about future plans with confidence, and demonstrated the kind of thoughtful leadership that could reassure both domestic and international observers. Isabella found herself genuinely impressed by the younger woman's poise under pressure. During the fourth course, a messenger arrived with a note that caused Isabella's heart to race. Eric had regained consciousness for several minutes, long enough to ask about the kingdom's affairs and to request that someone check on Isabella's well-being. The news spread quickly through the dining room, and Isabella saw the visible relief on every face around the table. The remainder of the dinner took on a celebratory quality that had been missing from the evening's earlier stages. Conversations became more animated, laughter returned to the room, and the underlying tension that had marked the crisis began to ease. Isabella proposed a toast to Eric's recovery that was met with enthusiasm from every guest. As the formal dinner concluded, Isabella found herself alone with Astrid in a small sitting room adjacent to the dining hall. For the first time in days, Astrid allowed herself to show the exhaustion and worry she had been hiding behind royal composure. "I don't know how he does it," Astrid confessed. "The constant decision-making, the weight of everyone's expectations, the knowledge that every choice affects thousands of people. I've had 3 days of it, and I feel like I'm drowning." Isabella smiled with understanding. He felt the same way when he first took the throne. We all do. But tonight proved that you have the strength for this role if circumstances require it. You commanded respect, projected confidence, and demonstrated real leadership. Eric would be proud. Their conversation was interrupted by another messenger, this one bearing news that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. Eric was asking to see her, and the doctors believed he was strong enough for a brief visit. Isabella found Eric propped up in his bed, pale and bandaged but unmistakably alive and alert. His eyes lit up when she entered the room, and she felt her carefully maintained royal composure crack for just a moment. "Isabella," he said, his voice weak but warm. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking care of my kingdom while I couldn't." She approached his bedside, abandoning protocol in favor of genuine human connection. "You scared us all terribly. But your kingdom is strong, and your sister has shown herself to be a remarkable leader. Everything will be here waiting for you when you're ready to return." Eric reached for her hand, a gesture that was both personal and symbolic. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said long ago. This accident has made me realize that we can't always wait for the perfect moment to speak important truths." Isabella felt her heart racing as she waited for him to continue. "I love you," he said simply. "Not just as an ally or a friend, but as a woman I hope to spend my life with. When I thought I might die, the thing that grieved me most was the thought of all the conversations we would never have, all the dinners we would never share." Isabella looked into his eyes, seeing vulnerability that she had never witnessed before during all their formal diplomatic encounters. In that moment, she realized that the silent language of royal dinners had been teaching them both to communicate in ways that went far beyond mere protocol. "I love you too," she whispered, finally, speaking the words that had been growing in her heart for years. "And, when you're well enough, we're going to host the most spectacular royal dinner in history to celebrate both your recovery and our engagement." As she sat beside his bed, holding his hand and planning their future together, Isabella reflected on how far she had traveled from that terrified 12-year-old girl who had trembled over choosing the wrong fork. The protocol she had learned, the diplomatic skills she had developed, and the confidence she had gained had brought her to this moment where personal happiness and political alliance could finally unite. The silent language of royal dinners had taught her to communicate in ways that transcended words, and now it would help her navigate the complex but joyful challenge of being both a queen and a woman in love. 10 years later, Queen Isabella sat at the head of the grand dining table in the newly constructed Unity Palace, watching her 8-year-old daughter, Crown Princess Sophia, struggle with the same protocols that had once brought her to tears. The irony was not lost on her that the most important diplomatic dinner of her reign was also serving as her daughter's introduction to the weight of royal responsibility. The occasion was unprecedented, the signing of the Continental Peace Accord, a treaty that would unite 12 kingdoms in a mutual defense and economic alliance that had been 15 years in the making. Representatives from across Europe had gathered for this historic moment, and the dinner that would follow the signing ceremony would be remembered as one of the most significant diplomatic events of the century. King Eric, now fully recovered and her husband of 8 years, sat to her right with the easy confidence of someone who had learned to balance the demands of kingship with the joys of marriage and fatherhood. Their union had not only strengthened the alliance between their two kingdoms but had also become a model for how royal marriages could combine political necessity with genuine affection. Princess Sophia, their eldest child, had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, along with a stubborn streak that was entirely her own. Tonight, she faced the challenge of dining properly in front of 12 foreign delegations, each of which would be observing her behavior as an indication of how well the next generation was being prepared for leadership. Isabella remembered her own terror at a similar age, but she also understood now what Lady Margaret had been trying to teach her all those years ago. These protocols were not arbitrary rules designed to make eating difficult, they were a sophisticated communication system that had evolved over centuries to allow people from different cultures to interact with mutual respect and understanding. The peace treaty they were celebrating tonight was itself a testament to the power of that communication system. Years of careful diplomatic dinners, each one building trust and understanding between former enemies, had created the foundation for this historic alliance. Isabella had personally hosted 47 formal dinners in service of these negotiations, each one a delicate balance of protocol, politics, and personal relationship building. The most challenging dinner had been with Empress Catherine of the Eastern Kingdoms, a formidable woman who had initially viewed Isabella as too young and inexperienced to be taken seriously. That dinner, held 3 years ago during a particularly tense period in the negotiations, had required Isabella to demonstrate both her diplomatic skills and her understanding of Eastern protocol traditions that differed significantly from Western customs. Catherine had arrived with her own set of expectations about how the evening should proceed, based on centuries of Eastern royal tradition. Isabella had spent months preparing for that encounter, learning about Eastern dining customs, studying the historical relationships between their kingdoms, and even taking lessons in the Eastern language to show proper respect for Catherine's heritage. The breakthrough had come during the third course, when Isabella had surprised Catherine by serving a traditional Eastern delicacy that had required weeks of preparation and the importation of rare spices. The gesture had demonstrated not just political courtesy but genuine respect for Catherine's culture, and it had opened the door to a friendship that had become crucial to the peace negotiations. Tonight's dinner would host Catherine alongside 11 other monarchs and heads of state, each bringing their own traditions and expectations. The menu alone had required 6 months to plan, incorporating elements from all 12 kingdoms while maintaining the sophisticated balance that would satisfy everyone without favoring anyone. Princess Sophia had been preparing for this evening for weeks, practicing the intricate etiquette that would be required when dining with so many different cultural traditions simultaneously. Isabella had watched her daughter's progress with a mixture of pride and concern, remembering her own struggles while hoping to spare Sophia some of the anxiety she had experienced. "Remember, darling," Isabella whispered to her daughter as the guests began to take their seats, "every person at this table was once a child learning these same lessons. They understand that perfection takes time." Sophia nodded solemnly, her small hands gripping her napkin with the same intensity Isabella remembered from her own childhood. The little princess was wearing a scaled-down version of formal court dress in pale blue, a color that had been chosen for its diplomatic neutrality and its association with peace and harmony. The seating arrangement for tonight's dinner had been perhaps the most complex ever attempted in royal dining history. Each delegation's position had been calculated to reflect their importance in the alliance while avoiding any placement that could be interpreted as showing favoritism or creating slight. Isabella had worked with protocol experts from all 12 kingdoms to create an arrangement that satisfied everyone's requirements while maintaining the symbolic importance of the event. Emperor Friedrich of the Germanic states, a man whose kingdom controlled crucial trade routes, sat to Isabella's left in recognition of his nation's economic importance to the alliance. Across from him sat King Louis of the southern provinces, whose military expertise had been essential during the final negotiations. Each placement told a story about the relationships that had made this alliance possible. As the first course was served, Isabella found herself thinking about all the individual relationships that had been built through royal dinners over the years. Emperor Friedrich had been initially skeptical of the alliance, viewing it as potentially limiting his kingdom's independence, but a series of carefully planned meals had gradually shown him the economic advantages that cooperation could bring. King Louis had presented a different challenge, having inherited a kingdom that had been at war with several other alliance members within living memory. Building trust with his former enemies had required dinners that acknowledged past conflicts while focusing on shared future benefits. Isabella had spent countless hours with her diplomatic staff, planning menus and conversation topics that would help former adversaries find common ground. The conversation throughout the early courses flowed smoothly, covering topics that ranged from art and culture to trade and technology. Isabella had learned over the years that the most successful diplomatic dinners were those that allowed relationships to develop naturally, without forcing political discussions too early in the evening. Princess Sophia performed admirably during these opening stages, answering polite questions from the various monarchs with the poise that had been drilled into her through years of preparation. Isabella noticed with approval how her daughter listened carefully to each speaker, asked thoughtful questions when appropriate, and demonstrated the kind of cultural curiosity that would serve her well as a future leader. Empress Catherine, seated several places down the table, caught Isabella's eye and nodded approvingly at Sophia's behavior. The Eastern monarch had become something of a mentor to Isabella over the years, and her approval of the young princess carried particular weight. As the meal progressed into its more substantial courses, the conversation naturally turned to the significance of the alliance they were celebrating. Each monarch spoke briefly about what the treaty meant for their kingdom, creating a verbal ceremony that complemented the formal signing that had taken place earlier in the day. Emperor Friedrich spoke eloquently about the economic opportunities that would flow from increased cooperation, while King Louis emphasized the security benefits that would come from mutual defense agreements. One by one, the leaders around the table articulated their vision for a future where their kingdoms worked together rather than competing against each other. When it came Isabella's turn to speak, she chose to focus on the next generation, looking directly at her daughter as she talked about the world they were creating for their children. Tonight, we celebrate not just what we have accomplished, but what we are making possible for those who will follow us. Princess Sophia will grow up in a world where the kingdoms around this table are partners rather than rivals, where differences are resolved through dialogue rather than warfare. The emotion in her voice was genuine, reflecting the deep satisfaction she felt at seeing the culmination of years of diplomatic work. The alliance represented more than political convenience, it was a fundamental shift toward a more cooperative and peaceful approach to international relations. As the evening moved toward its conclusion, Isabella reflected on how much her understanding of royal dining had evolved since that first terrifying meal with Lord Hendrik so many years ago. What had once seemed like arbitrary rules had revealed themselves to be tools for building understanding between people from vastly different backgrounds. The protocols that had once frustrated her were now second nature, allowing her to focus on the human connections that were the real foundation of successful diplomacy. She could read the subtle signals that indicated when a guest was comfortable or uncomfortable, when a conversation was productive or needed to be redirected, when a relationship was strengthening or required additional attention. Most importantly, she had learned that the silent language of royal dinners was really about respect, respect for tradition, respect for cultural differences, respect for the enormous responsibility that comes with leadership, and respect for the people whose lives are affected by the decisions made around these tables. Princess Sophia had successfully navigated her first major diplomatic dinner, demonstrating the same potential that Isabella hoped would one day make her a wise and effective leader. As the evening wound down and the various delegations prepared to depart, Isabella felt confident that the next generation was being properly prepared for the challenges they would inherit. The treaty signed earlier that day would reshape European politics for decades to come, but the relationships built and strengthened around the dinner table would be equally important in making that treaty succeed. The personal connections formed through shared meals, respectful conversation, and mutual recognition of common humanity would provide the foundation for resolving future disagreements and maintaining the peace they had worked so hard to achieve. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and Princess Sophia had been tucked into bed with stories of the historic evening she had witnessed, Isabella and Eric sat alone in their private sitting room, reflecting on what they had accomplished.
Do you think she understands what she witnessed tonight? Eric asked, referring to their daughter's first exposure to high-level diplomacy.
Isabella smiled, thinking about the intensity with which Sophia had watched every interaction, the careful attention she had paid to each speaker, and the pride she had shown in successfully completing her own small part in the evening ceremonies. She understands that something important happened tonight, and she understands that she played a role in it.
That's enough for now.
The deeper understanding will come with time and experience, just as it did for us. As she prepared for bed, Isabella thought about the long journey that had brought her from that terrified 12-year-old girl to the confident leader she had become. The silent language of royal dinners had taught her to communicate across cultural barriers, to build relationships that transcended political differences, and to use the power of hospitality to create lasting peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dinners to plan, new relationships to build and maintain. But tonight, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that the protocols she had once viewed as burdens had become the tools that allowed her to serve her people and contribute to a more peaceful world. The Continental Peace Accord would be remembered as one of the great diplomatic achievements of the age, but Isabella knew that its true foundation had been laid not in formal negotiation chambers but around dinner tables, where the ancient rituals of hospitality had worked their quiet magic to transform strangers into allies and former enemies into friends. The silent language of royal dinners had spoken once again, and the world was better for it.